All right, and so with that, we are going to move on to our keynote address with Kevin Morris, the FAA. Kevin, if you're ready to go, take it away.
Thanks, Zach, and thanks everyone for having me. It's a real pleasure to be here. I know that Taylor and Vic have been working for quite some time to try to get me out to this event, and they told me about how amazing and wonderful it is and all the people involved, and just watching this program start up, I would have to say that they are spot on. So this is pretty exciting, and that was a great lead in there by Jay with all the work that's being done with drones and how the space is also tying into the economy. Just a little plug, one of those did you know things. The FAA has a commercial space transportation division. Every rocket that's launched for commercial purposes does have to obtain a license from the FAA. So you can imagine there's been a lot of licenses going out. In fact, I think this year we're on schedule to have our 400th commercial space launch license issued. So that includes everything from the Starlinks that are going up on the Falcon rockets to the Starship SN 9, 10, 15, whatever number Mr. Musk may be on right now. But there's a whole division in the FAA that does a lot of that work too. So a little bit of a plug for us on that end. But let's get back down to earth here and a little bit on track here for drones. I apologize if I have to clear my throat or I sound a little bit raspy. About a week ago, I got over my annual sinus infection as the seasons change here. I live in Minnesota, and it got warm and then it got cold, and now it's snowing again. And I know that everybody on this call can sympathize with me on that. Being in Colorado, I understand that it's snowing a little bit there too this morning. But so let's get going here. Again, thanks for having me on board for today's presentation. A little bit about myself. Many of you might know me as the FAA drone guy. Please understand that's not a title I chose for myself. It's one of those nicknames or names that are sort of bestowed or assigned, if you will, to you. But I've been with the FAA for about 14 years now. Prior to that, I was an airline pilot. I was a flight instructor. I hold an airline transport pilot certificate with a type rating, all sorts of neat things, including one of the coolest things, which is my remote pilot certificate. So when I joined the FAA, drones, this was back in 2007, drones were just sort of starting to get going. There wasn't a lot of work being done by them yet. Clearly they were out there, they were available. They started to do commercial work, but it wasn't really until the last maybe 10 years that things really took off. Excuse me, no pun intended there. So in the FAA, that really interested me. So I started working with airlines when I first got hired. Then I got into aircraft accident investigation. And then for about the past 7 years, I really turned a corner into drones. And it's fascinating. As quickly as this industry is innovating and moving ahead, the FAA is trying to keep pace. And for a government agency, that is a monumental lift to try to keep pace with something as technological based as drones. So my current role with the FAA is with the Office of Communications. Just prior to this, I was in flight standards. So I helped publish a lot of rules, advisory circulars, guidance, both for Part 107 operators and recreational flyers. And then the FAA Office of Communication liked what I was doing, and they thought that, you know what, we could put this guy in front of a camera and he's not going to embarrass us, at least not yet. So they brought me into the Office of Communications, and now I'm in charge of coordinating all agency-wide UAS communications. So any press release, statement, tweet, or social media post goes through me. So if you see something that doesn't look right, now you know the guy to blame. But I want to back up a little bit and talk just about how we got here, because I think it's a fairly interesting story, and many of you are living through it right now. But drones aren't really new. Yeah, and I know that's not a news flash. I mean, they've really been around since World War I, right? What's new is what they're doing with industry, and what they're doing is with the economy, and how they're helping us as humans and with our work and all sorts of other amazing things that they do. So even though drones have been around a long time, it wasn't until like the early 80s, 1981, that the FAA actually published something related to drones. And of course, back then we didn't call them drones, we called them model aircraft. And that was an advisory circular. So you got to go way back to 1981 to see the first sort of FAA engagement, if you will, related to drones. Then it was quiet for a long time, all throughout the 80s, throughout the 90s, excuse me, even in early 2000s, it really wasn't changing. Well, that all completely changed once the technology and the availability of model aircraft became drones, if you will, in the mid 2000s. And in 2012, we issued public law, well, Congress issued Public Law 11295. And some of you might have been flying drones long enough to remember the old Section 336 days, the 333 exemptions that we had out there. And the FAA was requiring people to get recreational pilot certificates to fly drones. And it was really just this odd period of, we need to recognize the commercial value of drones, yet we need to somehow find a way to ensure that we keep the airspace safe for everyone. So even though there has been only one document in the last 100 years or so of drones, now we start to see a lot of changes. So that happened in 2012. Then of course, in 2016, the FAA published Part 107, the small UAS rule. And although a lot of us think of it as the commercial rule, it's really the civil small UAS rule. And so why I emphasize civil is because it's an important distinction. Part 107 is not just for commercial drones. Part 107 is for all civil, meaning non-public, and I'll touch on that in a minute, small, under 55 pounds, UAS operations. So why this is so important is because in the United States, if you're operating a drone less than 55 pounds, of course, including everything attached, you default to Part 107. Everybody has to operate under Part 107, unless, and then that's where the carve-outs come into place. So we have, back then it was Section 336 for rec flyers that morphed into Section 44809 with Public Law 115-254. And I know you were all promised no math in this presentation, but I'm throwing a lot of numbers at you. I apologize. But where we ended up is really three types of buckets. You've got the civil small unmanned aircraft system operation, which a lot of people call commercial, Part 107. You have the recreational flyer exemption. That's under Section 44809 of that last public law I mentioned. Then you have public aircraft operations, which are sort of their own standalone. I'm not really going to get into the public aircraft operations. That's fairly a niche operation, and it requires almost a whole other keynote to discuss just that segment. So I'm going to zero in on recreational flying under the exception and Part 107. Today's kind of a big day for Part 107. In fact, I've got the Zoom meeting open on my 3 monitors. I've got 5 different streams of things happening, and I've got my personal cell phone up and running and my work cell phone up and running because things are literally happening in real time. In fact, one of the comments from my manager was, how are you going to go do this keynote when we've got all this information coming out today about remote ID, ops over people, night flying? And I said, don't worry, I can handle it. So hopefully I can handle it here, but I've got a lot of information going today. I'm going to leave some of that to Vic Moss to discuss because Vic's going to have a great presentation on the new rules for Part 107. So I don't want to steal any of his thunder on that. But before I get into a little bit of the rec flyer versus Part 107, I just wanted to throw a few more numbers your way in terms of statistics. Where are we at with numbers? So the last time I checked, this is probably a couple of weeks old, these numbers are, but they're all relevant for our discussion today. We had just over 222,000 certificated remote pilots in the United States. That's a huge number. That's a lot of remote pilots out there. Now, that doesn't mean we have 222,000 people operating commercially. It just means that under the civil rule, again, we had almost just over, I should say, 222,000. When we talk about registrations, under Part 107, so you could probably draw a pretty solid line between these registration numbers and commercial operations. There's just over 368,000 registered UAS under Part 107. That's a lot. Now, those are one for one, as many of you know. So you have one aircraft under or two aircraft under Part 107, you're going to have one or two registrations. On the recreational side, which are not exactly a one-for-one, we have over 500,000, over 500,000 registered recreational users, I'll say, under Section 44809. And why I say it that way is because you can have more than one UAS registered to one number under the recreational flyer. So all told, I think it's a fair number to state that we probably have 1 million or more registered UAS. And I emphasize registered because there probably are a lot more that are not registered. We're trying to get information out to make sure everybody understands why we need to register. We also have tests to get those remote pilot certificates. And on the initial remote pilot test, so before any of you had a Part 107 certificate, if you are not a manned aircraft aviator, you went into a testing center, plunked down 150, 160 bucks, and you took a test. The pass rate on that test has hovered around 93% since its deployment, which is a pretty good number. So that means maybe a combination of things. Either we got the test right, which there's probably a few people that disagree with me on that, or people are doing their homework before going in and taking the test. I hope it's a little bit of both. I wouldn't want us to think we got the test wrong, but I also don't want people to think that they wouldn't need to study a little bit before going in and taking a test, particularly one that's going to cost you 150 or so bucks. When we had the recurrent test available, so before April 6th, we had around a 96% pass rate on the recurrent test at a testing center. So everyone really should, as a UAS community, pat themselves on the back for going in, doing the homework, studying, and being knowledgeable about taking those tests, because 93% and a 96% are great passing numbers for both of those courses. All right, so let me get into a little bit of rec flying and then Part 107, and then I hope to have time for a lot of questions at the end, because it's very rare that you can usually get direct access like this to an FAA person, unless you're a Vic Moss who's got my number and he just sends me texts all the time. But I want to provide you guys with the opportunity to answer some of your questions directly from the horse's mouth. So please, if you have questions as I go through this, put them into the Q&A, and Zach can get me those questions as we come through. So let's talk about recreational flying. This was a huge change with the last public law that Congress signed in. It was part of the FAA Reauthorization Act, but it really brought recreational flying in line with what all of you were probably already doing under Part 107, namely authorizations in airspace, but there were a few other things as well. So if somebody's going to be flying recreationally, remember, we start as a whole, everybody's under Part 107, unless you meet all the requirements of what I'm about to say. So in order to fly under this exception to the rule, Part 107, you do have to meet all these requirements. The first one is probably the biggest and sometimes causes the most confusion, but you need to be flying for recreational purposes only. Furtherance of business is thrown around quite a bit, but what we're really talking about here is what you're doing for the pure enjoyment of flying. This rule was most likely written by Congress members thinking of RC controlled airplanes, sort of the legacy, if you will, model aircraft community. So what they're doing for fun. You also have to follow safety guidelines. This is where it can get a little bit tricky. If you're flying under the exception, there are rules that the exception has, Congress mandated into law. One of those says, oh, and by the way, you also have to follow safety guidelines of a recognized community-based organization. More on that in a bit. Your flying has to be done visual line of sight. There are no waivers. There are no exemptions. There are no alternate means of compliance when you're flying under Section 44809. You cannot get a waiver to visual line of sight. You cannot get a waiver for altitude, things like that. There are no waivers for that. So if you want to do some of those more technically advanced operations, you're going to have to do that under Part 107. Obviously, they have to give way and not interfere with manned aircraft. We all pretty much do that. But this, as I touched on earlier, the big piece was the airspace authorizations. When Section 44809 came out, it required recreational flyers to obtain airspace authorizations just like Many of you do under Part 107. That was a big change, because if you remember, before that, all they had to do was notify the airport if they're flying within 5 miles. And it seemed really unfair on the surface. So why does somebody with the Part 107 remote pilot certificate that we tested have to do all this authorization checking, and recreational flyers only have to just notify, then they go fly? Well, there's a lot of nuance to that we won't get into today, but safe to say now they have to get that authorization. They're also restricted below 400 feet. That's different than Part 107. Part 107, there are some carve outs where you can operate above 400 feet, think tower inspection, things like that. They don't get those provisions as a recreational flyer. There is also a test that they're going to have to pass. And I'm going to touch on that here in just a little bit too, but they're going to need, whether you're a Part 107 remote pilot or not, if you're going to fly as a recreational flyer, you're going to have to take this test. So hang tight, I'm going to get back to that in a minute. The last thing is registration. And I do want to spend a little bit of time on this, because not only is it very important, but there are some very subtle differences between Part 107 and recreational flyers that I want to clear up. We're all very familiar, or most of us are probably very familiar with the weight. So if a drone weighs 0.55 pounds or less, it doesn't need to be registered. And that's absolutely true only if you're flying under Section 44809. That is the only time that minimum weight element for registration comes into play. If you're operating under Part 107, every single drone, regardless of weight, needs to be registered. And I want to point that out. So make sure that everybody's very clear on that. Help me get that message out, because there's a lot of people out there that still believe under Part 107, you don't need to register your drone if it weighs 0.55 pounds or less. And that's simply not true. Everything under Part 107 has to be registered. The other piece on registration is we still see people paying a lot of money for registration. In fact, just this morning, I Googled FAA registration. I just wanted to see what would come up first. The first 3 hits were not the FAA drone zone account. So if you pay more than $5 for registration, somebody's taking your money. It's not the FAA. So please go to the only website that's authorized to do registrations, which is our FAA drone zone account. It'll be a $5 charge. Your registration will be valid for 3 years. So I just wanted to emphasize that a little bit. Okay, jumping into CBOs and trust. Community-based organizations, or CBOs, the congressional mandate in that law required that the FAA recognize, for the first time ever, community-based organizations. This means that we have to have a process set up where organizations can apply that meet the criteria that Congress set forth to become a community-based organization. And the FAA has to review that, including their safety guidelines, and then recognize them. We have to be very careful with terms here, because we don't approve or accept them, we recognize them. Approve and accept have some very heavy meanings in the FAA, so that's why I'm sort of clarifying the point here. We're still trying to get to that. That's a lot of work. That's a whole new process in the FAA, and I know many of you are like, well, you've had 2 years. I can tell you that I've been working on it personally for 2 years, and it is mind-numbing how long this takes to get through. But regardless, the expectation is that sometime this summer, there will be a process available for people to apply, organizations to apply, to be recognized as community-based organizations. We'll have an advisory circular on this process to help you with the application. We've done a lot of work to make sure that the application portal is as straightforward as we can, which brings me to the test. So some of you might have seen, we announced that the recreational UAS safety test, or TRUST, we love acronyms, is coming. Before we get there, we needed to open up an application period for interested parties that wanted to administer the trust on behalf of the FAA. So that application period closed at the end of April. We're reviewing the applications that we have now, but the goal is, once we roll out the trust, when it's available, you will be able to go to a variety of locations to take this test online for free that will issue you a completion certificate so that you can fly in accordance with the rule, which means, again, Congress saying you have to pass this aeronautical knowledge and safety test. The test will include training as well as knowledge check questions. And there's no way to fail it unless you, I guess, quit the test, but you'll be corrected to 100%. We really designed it so that people wouldn't be afraid to take it, that there would be almost no barriers to take it, so that people would take it, because it doesn't do any good for us to put out a test that nobody takes. So more on that coming, but that is absolutely an element of Section 44 required. And yes, if you hold a remote pilot certificate, you're going to have to take that test, because there are differences under 44809. For example, you can fly an 80-pound drone under Section 44809 as a recreational flyer. You can't do that under Part 107. So there are some differences in there as well. But now let's get to today. There is some pretty big news happening. As most of you know, two big rules became effective today. One of them is remote ID, don't panic, hang tight, stay with me. And the other is operations over people. And why I say don't panic, hang tight, stay with me is because even though remote ID is effective today, compliance, when you actually have to start broadcasting a remote ID signal, is not happening for almost 30 months. So it's a ways down the road. We're like 2.5 years from now before the compliance date. And there is a whole litany of things that has to happen between 30 months from now and today. So you're probably going to start to see some messaging today that rolls out that talks about the remote ID rule being effective today. But I just wanted to make sure everybody understands that doesn't mean you have to broadcast remote ID today. And Vic Moss might touch more a little bit on that as well. Part of that, tying back into recreational flying, are FAA recognized identification areas. Probably the worst name of an element to describe what the element actually is I can possibly think of. What it really is saying is that we are going to have authorized certain areas in the United States where remote ID is not required. We're calling those areas FAA recognized identification areas. They didn't ask me for the name. But what we're going to end up doing is about 18 months from now, so 1.5 years from now, again, this is a remote ID thing. A lot of the stuff is way into the future, but 18 months from now, we will begin approving locations. And they're really designed for the sort of the legacy clubs where perhaps standard remote ID or broadcast remote ID modules don't really fit the bill. So they need areas where they can operate without having to worry about trying to affix remote ID equipment to their aircraft. They will have those areas to operate in. They'll have to remain within those areas. They'll be restricted to visual line of sight, but sometime in September of 2022, these sites will become active. So then I want to jump into Part 107, and I promised I wasn't going to steal a whole bunch of Vic Moss's thunder because he's coming up next. By the way, Taylor, thanks for putting me in front of him so I don't have to have the tough job of following Vic Moss in a presentation. Kudos for you to that. But for Part 107, today we announced that the operations over people rule is fully in effect. And I say fully because many of you probably are well aware that on April 6th, portions of that new rule became effective. So let me clarify. On April 6th, we did some changes to the certification, testing, training requirements for Part 107. Namely, for the initial knowledge test and for online training courses, we updated content to include remote ID, ops over people rule changes. So if somebody you know is going to go take their initial test for their remote pilot certificate, make sure that they are aware that there are going to be questions on there about remote ID, operating over people, and operating at night that follow the new rule. That's in there. The same with the online training course. We also got rid of the recurrent ground training course. So because we created a brand new online free recurrent training course for Part 107 pilots that's available right now that any Part 107 pilot can take, whether you're current or not, we got rid of the one that was at the testing centers where you pay $150. So if you're hearing something about, oh, I got to schedule my recurrent test, I don't want to have to pay $150, please let that person know that, one, they shouldn't even be able to schedule it, but two, they can go online to FAAsafety.gov and take that online training course. So there's a lot of stuff that's updated already, but things that are happening today relate to flying at night without a waiver, or perhaps operating over people without a waiver. But before you go launch that drone and start flying over people at night, hang tight. Vic's got a lot of information coming up about operating over people. And while it's a great step forward, it's not a blank check to go do that. And I think we're going to have a hard time communicating that and get everybody on board. Operating at night also is going to require some airspace authorizations, just like you have to do in the daytime for controlled airspace locations. Your Bravo, Charlie, and Delta airspace, your Echo 2 airspace designated for an airport. I think I said that right. But those classes of airspace will still require an authorization. And we're going to have information available today on how to get that authorization. So we've been working with air traffic over the past 5 or 6 months, at least, coming up with a solution for that. And there'll be more information coming out shortly on that. In fact, it might even come out in the middle of my keynote here. That's why I have my screens up and running and trying to update. So talking about updates, I thought I'd throw a bit of this just in before I start taking some questions. Some of you might be familiar with the Aviation Safety Reporting System, or the ASRS. This is a NASA program, actually, that takes in pilot reports, traditionally of manned aircraft, where things have gone wrong. You can submit voluntary, anonymous safety reports of something that happened on a flight, or maybe you unintentionally broke a rule. That's been a great resource, excuse me, for general aviation pilots for a long time. It's now available for UAS. So the same type of reporting and protections that the safety system offers are now available for UAS, which is great news. So if you see something or you have an event, not even if a rule is not broken, but something goes wrong and you thought, boy, I sure hope this doesn't happen to anyone else, the NASA Aviation Safety Reporting System is going to be a great tool for you to submit that information, because it's gathered and disseminated to anybody that wants to be on that mailing list. Now, it also offers a little bit of a protection in case the FAA says you did break a rule. If you filed a report with the Aviation Safety Reporting System, you can sort of mitigate some of the enforcement action the FAA will take. But again, that's another decision. Please go take a look at, if you just Google NASA ASRS, Alpha Sierra Romeo Sierra, you'll get to that website for more information. So last thing I go before I take some questions here, please try to stay up to date. Things are changing so quickly with UAS that unless you're following us or you're dialed into a Drone Pro or the FAA safety team or anybody really on this call trying to help each other out here, please follow us on social media. We've got a couple of Drone Zone accounts, one on Twitter, one on Facebook, that are specifically dedicated to drones. We also have our standard FAA accounts on Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn, all the social medias really. But if that doesn't work for you, reach out to somebody like Vic Moss in your area. Vic is one of our FAA safety team safety reps. He's a drone pro and he's a wealth of information. And there are a lot of people like him and the numbers are growing every day. So there's a lot of resources available to make sure you stay up to date. And Zach, I think I've talked enough. And if we have some questions, I'll be more than happy to answer.
Yeah, thanks, Kevin. We really appreciate that. And we do have a couple of questions queued up for you and see if a few more trickle in. And I'll just start with the top one. This is from Phil Crosley. And Kevin, I don't know if you can see these questions yourself or it's just me reading them to you, but the question is, low altitude authorization and notification is a tremendous innovation by the FAA. Rejections of LAANC authorization requests without any explanation, as in zero altitude areas, though, don't help us learn what to do better, either for aviation airspace safety or for the caliber of our authorization requests. How does the FAA think we should learn what to do differently in order to submit requests that the FAA is willing to authorize?
That's a great question. Thanks, Phil, for sending that in, because you bring up an important point. What those requests are in FAA parlance are considered further coordination requests. So if you submit a LAANC authorization request and you're below a UAS facility map, you'll get that authorization back in near real time. If you submit an authorization request to go above or to fly in a zero grid, let's say, we consider those to be further coordination requests. There's a lot of work to be done on that. And I don't think we've quite nailed it yet. And Phil's question sort of emphasizes that belief. When you submit a LAANC authorization request for further coordination, it ends up going to that facility, and it goes to an email inbox in the system, in the LAANC system that they have at that facility. Air traffic controllers are not required, based on workload, to check that inbox or check the LAANC app on their systems. So what happens a lot of times is that with workload or various other reasons, that inbox or the LAANC application does not get checked at the facility. After 24 hours of your request, it just drops out of the system. So on the user end, it's very confusing. You've submitted a request, you waited, now the time you wanted to fly has gone past, and you don't receive a word, not even the day after, the next day after that, or the day after that. That is something that we are working on solving with air traffic. Maybe not so much in terms of here's what you need to do to get the approval to fly in a zero grid, but at least that there's a closed loop feedback to the applicant. Sorry, your application was denied. Here's why. You might not like the reasons, you might not agree with the reasons, but at least you get something back. So Phil, that's a great point. It's something that we are aware of. And with all the different facilities and working with air traffic, which is its own sort of beast within the FAA, we're trying to get to that solution, because we hear you loud and clear. It's not acceptable to not have that transparency or feedback from LAANC, and it's something that we are working on. So I don't have a great answer for you now, but I can tell you that we are aware of that. It's not the way we want it to work, and we're trying to find a solution.
Thanks, Kevin. And then two questions here that are, I believe, related. The first one, when will the FAA Remote Pilot Study Guide and other materials be updated? And then, Kevin, the second question, I just finished, and this is from Doug Sutton, I just finished taking the recurrent Part 107 course and test. Throughout the course, it referred to the new Unmanned Aerial Systems Handbook, which is not yet available. When will that be available?
Another great question. You guys are spot on. This is good stuff here. We had that small UAS handbook ready to go, released on the 6th, completely written, everything's done. It got through a level of review that stopped it. And I'm not going to name names because I value my job. But one of the things that came back was some of the content we had written in there was considered too technical and not plain language enough. Plain language is a big thing in government, in particular with the FAA, that when we're publishing information, it has to be done in a manner that people can understand. And I know all of you are pointing to Part 107 going, yeah, but I know. But we do have to get that information out in a manner that's easily understandable. There was some concern on that small UAS handbook that the information in there didn't meet that from cover to cover. However, that being said, there is information out there right now that you can use to help you get through, in particular, the new portions that are on those on the test or the online training courses, which the first and foremost is Advisory Circular 107-2A as an alpha. I checked with our group that designed the online training course that submits the questions for the initial aeronautical knowledge test. All the remote ID, ops over people, and night stuff that's in those tests or online training courses is covered in that advisory circular. So really the only new stuff that's on the test is it's actually all covered in Advisory Circular 107-2A. So I would start there. And we we have somebody working every single day on getting this handbook out because it's an important document and we really want to get it out. We expect to get it out. We thought we were going to get it out, and then now we're in a little bit of a weird hold. But until then, if you can direct people at least to the advisor circular, that will help them with the new elements that are on the test and training courses. Great questions.
Okay. Let me see if we have any other questions here. Not really a question, but just a comment from Rick Moen. He said, just wanted to give kudos to the FAA with the SGI waivers and further coordination for us to fly drones for network restoration efforts after Hurricane Laura last year.
I will pass that along, Rick. That is something that is near and dear to a lot of our hearts. We have a lot of former law enforcement firefighters that work with us here in the FAA, and the SGI, the Special Governmental Interest Process, is key to me allowing the whole drones for good concept to become a reality. It's the natural disaster work. It's and I don't want to take anything away from Jay, it's the authorized drones around wildfires and things like that we like to see, the authorized ones. Because that does absolutely help protect and save lives. Literally, search and rescue is another element where drones, I think, are just fantastic. I love seeing those stories where they take the drone up with FLIR and they find somebody in the woods at night that they may never have found before the temperatures get below freezing. So the SGI process is the huge step forward to enable those operations. So Rick, I will pass that information along to our counterparts in the UAS division. So thank you for that.
And just to add to that, Kevin, it seems like the more public we can make all of the news stories about those sorts of efforts, it's going to go a long way toward public acceptance of UAS. So very helpful there too. And Kevin, you're going to stick around for the rest of this in case a few more questions pop up?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm able to stick around for about the next hour or so.
Okay.
And let me just, before I jump off here. So it just rolled in. So you guys are going to be the first to hear it. So this goes back to my this just in comment. We have enabled a process to allow you to use LAANC to get your night airspace authorizations, because today that was one of the big elements of the Ops Over People rule going into effect today, is that you can fly your drone at night without a waiver. Well, if you're in controlled airspace, you need to have an airspace authorization. And we have a process that we just released for that. It's going to involve obtaining a daytime LAANC authorization that you can use in combination with a national authorization extension letter that's available to everyone. It's available on our website now. That'll allow you to fly at night. So I know I'm running out of time and I don't nearly have enough time, and I'm not throwing your schedule off here to talk about this, but we do have the process released now. You will be able to obtain a daytime authorization, doesn't matter what time, and you'll get a nighttime authorization for that entire calendar day. So if you wanted to fly at 3 a.m. tomorrow, you would apply for a daytime authorization tomorrow. With that national authorization extension, it's going to allow you to fly from 12 a.m. tomorrow to 11:59 p.m. tomorrow. So that will be the interim until we get all the information and technological advancements needed into LAANC to make nighttime just like daytime. So for anybody wondering how are we going to be able to fly at night today, we have the process, it's out. And I'm sorry it came at, 10:58 Central Time here, but I'd like to have gone into a little bit more on that. But anyway, it's out. I'm going to post the link or try to get the link into the chat so everybody can read the website with all the information on that. But Zach, I just wanted to touch on that. And now I think I'm officially out of time.
Okay, great. And I just wanted to pass on one other comment from Taylor, our president. We really appreciate the FAA delaying the effective date of these new regulations to the event today. It must have taken some effort. So thanks.
No, we just dropped Taylor and Vic's name, and they said, all right, we'll delay it till the next roundup. I said, perfect.
Right. I've tried dropping their names before and it hasn't worked like that, but must have worked this time. All right. Kevin, thank you again. We just really, really appreciate this. And